The sound of the slap cracked through the airplane cabin like thunder striking metal, sudden, sharp, and devastating. For a moment, everything stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence, fingers froze over tray tables and screens, even the hum of the engines seemed to pull back in stunned silence. All eyes turned to row 16. 16-year-old Marcus Williams sat frozen, his cheeks stinging, his breath caught halfway between inhale and scream. The world narrowed to a ringing in his ears, and the furious, disbelieving glare of the man who had just struck him, Warren Caldwell, a 50-something executive, wrapped in arrogance and entitlement, his hand still half raised, trembling. "I told you to stay in your place, boy." The words, thick with venom, hung in the air like smoke. Heads turned, phones rose. The echo of centuries of hate of power, misused of dignity, stripped in public view, vibrated through that sentence. Marcus didn't speak. He couldn't. His hands clenched the armrests as he forced himself to remain still, to not give in to the instinct to fight back or to flee. He had been taught by his father by experience that even when you're the victim, defending yourself can be dangerous if your skin is a certain color. Passengers watched in stunned silence, some in horror, some in confusion, some unsure of what had just happened, but sensing the electricity in the air. Flight attendants moved quickly, but not quickly enough to bridge the space between their stations and the unfolding chaos. It had taken only seconds, but those seconds had cracked something open in the fragile order of Flight 1742. 7 rows behind them, an elderly man quietly closed the book in his lap. He was unremarkable at first glance, mid-60s, slightly hunched, his salt and pepper hair combed neatly back, his eyes hooded with age and memory. But when he stood, something shifted. His movement wasn't rushed, but purposeful. His spine straightened not from pride, but from a reservoir of strength buried beneath decades of survival, silence, and something that now demanded voice. "Sir, please sit down," a flight attendant called urgently, still several rows away, but the man's voice came before she could reach him, calm, clear, and unmistakably accented. "I can't do that. Not this time." There was no anger in his tone, no volume, just purpose. And with that sentence, Michael Cavich, retired veteran terminal cancer patient and reluctant holder of a long-guarded truth, stepped forward into the heart of a moment that would change not only Marcus's life but his own. 6 hours earlier, the day had begun like any other. Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport buzzed with early morning energy announcements echoing over PA systems, security lines winding endlessly, and rolling suitcases clicking rhythmically over polished tiles. Among the crowd at Gate C-42 stood Marcus Williams, 16 years old, wearing a navy hoodie, slim jeans, and sneakers too clean to be casual. He stood next to his father, Dr. David Williams, tall, composed, with the presence of someone used to high-stakes decisions and high-pressure rooms. "You got your boarding pass?" his father asked for what Marcus counted as the third time in 15 minutes. Marcus rolled his eyes softly, though not unkindly. "Yes, Dad. It's in the wallet you gave me, exactly where you checked twice already." Dr. Williams didn't apologize. Instead, he nodded the tight lines in his forehead, easing a fraction. A world-renowned cardiothoracic surgeon, he was accustomed to preparing for every possible scenario. In his world, failure to double-check could cost lives. That mindset didn't turn off just because his son was heading to the National Science Decathlon. "And your project files, you backed them up to the cloud, the USB, your email, and sent a copy to Professor Diaz." Marcus smirked. "All of the above." Dr. Williams exhaled a little deeper this time. He reached out his large hands, resting on Marcus's shoulders. At 16, Marcus was already as tall as his father, though leaner, his body all restless energy and future promise. They shared the same deep eyes, same jawline, same surgeon's hands, with long, graceful fingers, though Marcus had no plans of wielding a scalpel. His path pointed to the stars, not to operating rooms. "I'm proud of you," his father said finally. "Not just for the competition, but for everything you've handled this year." That sentence hung between them. Everything was a loaded word. It meant the absence of Marcus's mother, gone on what was supposed to be a 6-week sabbatical to Paris, now stretched nearly a year. It meant managing the house, keeping up perfect grades, cooking his own meals, and never once dropping the ball. His father rarely said it outright, but the admiration was there, even when buried beneath a fortress of structure and preparation. Thanks, Dad, Marcus said, his voice quiet. They're boarding your group, Dr. Williams noted, glancing at the screen. Yeah, I should go. Dr. Williams hesitated, then pulled Marcus into an unexpected tight hug. Public displays of affection were rare from him, and Marcus returned the embrace, caught off guard by the warmth of it. Call me when you land, his father murmured, and again tomorrow, before and after the competition. Win or lose. I know the drill, Marcus smiled, stepping back. Love you, son. Love you too. As Marcus joined the boarding line, emotions tangled inside him: reluctance, independence, anxiety, pride. He wanted to live up to the legacy his father represented, to prove that black brilliance didn't have to shout to be heard. But more than anything, he wanted to be seen for who he was. Not just the son of a surgeon, not just a bright kid from Atlanta, but Marcus Williams, soon to be finalist in one of the most prestigious science competitions in the country. And with that, he walked toward the jet bridge, completely unaware that this flight would test far more than his intellect. The boarding line moved slowly, each passenger shuffled forward in increments, absorbed in screens or conversation, or the mechanical rituals of air travel. Marcus's mind wandered, calculating gravitational wave formulas in the back of his head, running through bits of his presentation, trying not to fixate on the empty space his mother used to occupy during moments like this. His distraction nearly caused him to bump into the man ahead of him, a white man in a sharp grey suit, expensive cologne trailing behind him, every inch of him screaming, "Executive." The man turned his face tight with irritation, but he schooled his expression quickly, replacing it with a forced, patronizing smile. Careful there, young man. First time flying, there was something in his tone, just enough emphasis on young man, just enough arch in his brow, that rubbed Marcus the wrong way. It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them. As if Marcus being there was a minor inconvenience that required acknowledging. Marcus straightened instinctively, shifting into what his father called his Harvard interview voice, precise, articulate, ironed with control. No, sir. Just momentarily distracted. My apologies. The man blinked, clearly surprised. His eyes lingered a beat too long, as if reassessing the hoodie-wearing teenager who didn't match the script he had mentally written. Then he gave a short nod and turned away, without another word. Marcus exhaled through his nose. He had seen that look before. The recalibration. The micro-moment when someone realized their assumptions didn't align with reality. He had grown used to it, if not numb. Still, it left a residue, a subtle weight, like humidity clinging to skin. A tap on the shoulder broke his thoughts. He turned to find a petite, older woman smiling up at him. Her hair was white-styled in a neat bob, and her outfit, crisp linen and tasteful accessories, radiated quiet wealth. I couldn't help overhearing, she said, her voice warm with a soft southern accent. Are you traveling alone? Marcus forced a polite smile. He had been asked this question so many times, always, by well-meaning older women who couldn't picture a young black teenager traveling solo without imagining trouble. He'd learned how to preempt the assumptions. Yes, ma'am, heading to Los Angeles for an academic competition. Her eyes brightened. National Science Decathlon, his eyebrows lifted in surprise. Yes, actually, my grandson competed last year. He didn't make the finals, but he's at Georgia Tech now. That's where I'm hoping to go, Marcus replied, genuinely pleased. Or MIT if the scholarship comes through. Well, with the NSDA on your resume, I'd say you're on the right track. She extended her hand. I'm Grace Chen. Marcus Williams, he replied, shaking her hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. Let me guess you're working on something with black holes. Marcus laughed, caught off guard. Actually, yes. My project models gravitational waves from binary black hole mergers. She smiled, eyes twinkling. Fascinating. My late husband was an engineer on the Apollo program. We watched the moon landing together at Cape Canaveral. Before Marcus could ask more, the gate agent called for first-class passengers to board. Mrs. Chen moved toward the boarding door with a parting smile. Maybe we'll continue this conversation on the plane. Good luck, Marcus. As she disappeared into the jet bridge, Marcus felt a flicker of warmth. Maybe this flight wouldn't be so bad after all, but that optimism would be short-lived, because waiting in seat 16C was a man in a grey suit with a clenched jaw and a mind already made up. 20 minutes later, Marcus stepped into the narrow aisle of the airplane, weaving his way past occupied rows and murmured conversations. The cabin had that distinct scent of recycled air and just wiped plastic, and already overhead bins were stuffed to capacity. His eyes scanned row numbers until they landed on 16C. His stomach dipped. There he was, the man from the boarding line. Grey suit, tablet in hand, jaw set with the permanence of someone who wore disapproval like cologne. Marcus's seat was the dreaded middle one, wedged tightly between this man and a teenage girl at the window. She was reading a paperback, dark hair shielding her face. She looked about his age, maybe a year older. "Excuse me," Marcus said softly, gesturing toward the seat. The man didn't immediately move. He looked up, recognition flickering, then that same tight smile formed. "I had hoped you'd be seated elsewhere," he muttered, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus didn't respond. He'd already decided this flight was not going to shake him. With effort, he maneuvered into his seat, trying to avoid brushing either of his rowmates. Not easy. Economy class was a masterclass in spatial tension. Just as he was settling in, the girl beside him turned slightly. "They really should design these seats for actual humans," she said, her voice dry and friendly. "I'm Sophie." "Marcus," he replied, surprised by her openness. "Nice to meet you, Marcus. If I fall asleep and accidentally lean on you, just shove me gently." He chuckled, then nodded at the book in her lap. "Dune. Solid choice. You've read it 3 times. The movie's good, but barely scratches the surface." Her amber eyes lit up. "My dad says it was his favorite book when he was my age, so I thought I'd give it a shot." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp clearing of the throat. The man beside them, still absorbed in his tablet, spoke without looking up. "Some of us are trying to work. If you could keep the chatter down." Sophie mimed, zipping her lips shut with exaggerated drama, making Marcus stifle a laugh. The tension, though faint, was already seeping in an invisible fog, coiling between politeness and hostility. As the rest of the passengers filed in, Marcus pulled out his earbuds, ready to disappear into music. But before he could connect them, the man next to him elbowed his arm off the shared rest. "Sorry," Marcus muttered instinctively, even though the space intrusion hadn't been his fault. The man said nothing, just widened his posture, staking claim to a seat he apparently believed was entirely his. Marcus hesitated, then in a quiet act of resistance placed his arm back on the rest. The man's jaw flexed, but he didn't push again. It was a small win, but Marcus felt the weight of it. Then the girl beside him leaned in slightly and whispered, "You ever meet someone and immediately want to assign them a villain name?" Marcus smiled. "He's definitely got supervillain energy. Something like Captain Microaggression." Sophie let out a stifled laugh. The plane door closed with a hiss. The cabin dimmed, and somewhere in the space between takeoff and turbulence, a connection began to form between 2 teenagers who, for all their differences, understood each other perfectly, and a tension with the man beside them that was far from over. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Marcus sank back into his seat, earbuds dangling uselessly in one hand. The pressure in his chest wasn't from takeoff anxiety, it was the slow, gnawing awareness that came from navigating a space where you were simultaneously invisible and hypervisible. That uncomfortable duality was something Marcus had grown up with. He'd learned to shrink himself just enough to avoid confrontation, just enough to not be seen as a threat, but not so much that he seemed insecure. Caldwell, the man beside him, had perfected the art of weaponizing presence. He didn't need to speak to make Marcus feel unwelcome. His posture, his occasional sighs, the calculated way he took up space, all screamed a message Marcus had heard 1,000 times in 1,000 ways. "You don't belong here." But today something in Marcus had shifted. Maybe it was the way his father had looked at him at the airport pride, softening his usually reserved features. Maybe it was Mrs. Chen who had spoken to him like an equal, not a curiosity. Maybe it was Sophie with her unapologetic kindness and sarcastic sparkle. Whatever it was, it gave him the courage to push back, if only in small, quiet ways. The plane lifted off the ground, the engines roaring, pressing them into their seats. Marcus exhaled slowly, clutching the armrest, feeling Sophie's hand briefly graze his as she offered a comforting squeeze. It was so casual, so natural, and yet to him it felt like armor. As the aircraft leveled out, the noise of the cabin settled into a steady hum. Sophie reached for a notepad and began scribbling something. A moment later, she nudged Marcus and tilted the pad toward him. "He seems fun." Betty's a riot at parties. Marcus grinned and gestured for the pen. Total Karen energy. But in a suit. They passed the pad back and forth like covert operatives trading jokes about Caldwell's aura of superiority. Each quip was a spark, a shared rebellion in the form of teenage wit. Sophie's humor wasn't just funny, it was deliberate. She saw what Marcus saw, named it without hesitation, and didn't ask him to explain or soften it for her comfort. Eventually, Caldwell noticed their exchange. He shifted his weight and said without looking at them, "Some of us have important matters to attend to. I'd appreciate it if you kept the childish games to yourselves." Sophie turned to him, her tone syrupy. "Of course, sir. Wouldn't want to disturb your Excel spreadsheets." The man flushed and resumed typing, lips pressed into a bloodless line. As the flight settled into its mid-air rhythm, Marcus's focus began to drift, not to sleep, but to memories. The Times teachers had praised him for being so well-spoken, like it was surprising. The side glances in department stores, the way strangers clutched purses a little tighter in elevators. Most days he brushed it off. Rationalized it, compartmentalized it, but in row 16B, between the smirking cruelty of a suited man and the unflinching kindness of a stranger, the contrast was too stark to ignore. And as he looked out the window toward the clouds stretching endlessly below, Marcus realized something. He wasn't just on a flight to a competition, he was in the middle of a test, far more personal one he hadn't signed up for, but one he had no choice but to pass. With dignity, with restraint, and when necessary, with defiance. Hundreds of miles behind them, in a quiet neighborhood just outside Atlanta, the late morning sun had filtered gently through the windows of a small brick house, glinting off the garden tools still resting beside freshly turned soil. That morning, Michael Cavich had been pulling weeds, an ordinary ritual in what had become an ordinary life. His roses had started to bloom. The mint by the porch had grown unruly again. He'd knelt carefully, mindful of the ache in his knees, and felt the ground breathe beneath him. And then the phone rang. Dr. Hassa Patel's voice was calm, measured like a person used to saying the unsayable. "Michael, the results confirm our suspicions. It's stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I'm very sorry." He'd thanked her. He'd asked for numbers. 4 to 6 months. Maybe a little longer with treatment. But the word maybe didn't carry much weight when you were 66 and already counting time in seasons, not years. He didn't cry. He didn't curse fate. He just sat for a while in his favorite chair, one his late wife had always threatened to replace, and listened to the silence. It wasn't fear that gripped him. It was urgency. There were still things he hadn't said. Debts unpaid, wrongs left untouched by apology or atonement. Some weren't his fault. Some absolutely were. And so 2 days later, Michael booked a last-minute flight to Los Angeles. He packed a single suitcase, left a letter for his daughter explaining only that he had unfinished business. The truth was too old, too complicated to fit in a voicemail or a conversation cut short by emotion. Now seated in 23D, watching the clouds drift past the oval window of Flight 1742, Michael sipped a small cup of water and listened to the low hum of the engines. It was strange to be in the sky again. His first flight had been in 1975, a transport plane filled with young men heading to Vietnam, fear humming beneath their bravado. He still remembered the smell of canvas, the metallic tang of nerves, the way his fingers had gripped the rifle he didn't want to fire. The world had changed so much since then, and yet not enough. A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. "First time flying?" asked the young woman beside him. She wore a navy hijab, her face open and kind. Her badge clipped to her lanyard read, "Fatima Ahmed, UCLA Medical Center resident." Michael smiled. "Not quite, but it's been a while." "Me too," she said. "I'm moving, starting my residency in pediatrics." "Congratulations. That's a noble path," she beamed. "My parents are already planning my wedding and my retirement party, I think." Michael chuckled. "That sounds efficient. May I ask what brings you to LA? He hesitated, the well-rehearsed lie on the tip of his tongue, visiting an old friend, sightseeing. But then something in Fatima's face, in the steady compassion of her eyes, disarmed him. "To right an old wrong," he said quietly. "Something I should have done a long time ago." She nodded, not asking for more. "That takes courage," she said. "Most people let those things stay buried." Michael looked out the window again. Maybe that's the real cowardice. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Fatima opened a medical journal and let the conversation rest. As the plane pressed westward, Michael closed his eyes. He wasn't sure what he would find in Los Angeles, whether his apology would be welcomed or scorned. But he knew one thing: he would not leave this world with that silence intact. Some things must be said, some truths demand the light, and for Michael Kavich, this was the beginning of the reckoning. At the front of the economy cabin, flight attendant Amara Davis moved with a practiced ease born of 11 years in the sky. Her hands moved automatically: ginger ale, no ice, water with lemon, scotch on the rocks, each interaction wrapped in a pleasant smile and professional detachment. But behind her eyes, Amara missed nothing. She could sense tension before it had a name, spot it in a sideways glance, in the tight set of a jaw, in the kind of smile that never touched the eyes. Her uniform might as well have been a psychologist's coat. She knew when people were uneasy, and she knew the moment she reached row 16 that something was off. The man in the aisle seat, Caldwell, according to the manifest, had an energy she'd seen before. The subtle over-assertion, the exaggerated professionalism that often disguised disdain. The way he leaned toward the black teenager beside him with performative civility. His gestures a little too sharp, his voice just a little too firm. She lingered briefly. "Everything all right in row 16?" she asked, directing her question toward Marcus, but addressing them all. Caldwell looked up first, his expression morphing into bland pleasantness so quickly it made her skin crawl. "Perfectly fine, thank you. Just having a friendly conversation with the young man here." Marcus gave a tight, rehearsed smile. "We're good, thanks." But Amara's instincts didn't agree. She continued down the aisle, already calculating her next return visit. Back in the galley, she found her colleague James refilling the coffee pot. "Keep an eye on 16, she murmured. James raised an eyebrow. The suit Amara nodded. "He's giving me a weird vibe, especially toward the black kid and the girl next to him. Not overt, but enough. The kid's too polite, too still, like he's making himself small." "Copy that," James said, grabbing a tray of snacks. "I'll pass through with the pretzels of justice." They exchanged a brief smile, gallows humor that masked the deeper truth. This wasn't uncommon. Amara had fielded more racially coded complaints than she could count. Always the same script: someone felt uncomfortable, someone was being disruptive. Someone didn't seem to belong, and it was always the same passengers making the same faces when asked to elaborate. Sure enough, the call button above row 16 lit up 10 minutes later. Amara sighed inwardly and made her way back past rows of headphones and half-eaten cookies to find Caldwell looking thoroughly inconvenienced. "Excuse me," he said, folding his arms. "I paid for a seat where I could work in peace. Is there any possibility of relocating me to premium economy?" Amara's face didn't change. "I'm sorry, sir. We're at full capacity today." Caldwell lowered his voice not quite low enough. "These teenagers are being disruptive, giggling, passing notes. It's making it impossible to concentrate." Before Sophie could defend herself, Amara lifted a hand gently. "The universal flight attendant code for 'I've got this.' I understand your concern," she said evenly. "However, as I mentioned, we don't have available seating, and from what I've observed, the passengers here are conversing quietly, which is perfectly acceptable behavior." Caldwell stiffened. "I shouldn't have to wear headphones to block out inconsiderate behavior. With respect, sir, we haven't received complaints from any other passengers. I trust everyone in this row will continue being considerate." Her gaze landed briefly on Marcus. The boy gave a faint nod, his expression unreadable but grateful. As Amara walked away, she didn't feel relief. She felt a knot forming, a familiar premonition. This man wasn't just annoyed, he was building a narrative, and Amara knew how those stories usually ended. Not with complaints, not with apologies, but with moments that turned ugly fast. As the cabin dimmed into its mid-flight lull, a fragile peace seemed to settle over row 16, fragile but far from restful. Marcus sat rigidly in his seat, earbuds in but no music playing, his posture too careful, too composed. Sophie, who had resumed reading, kept shooting glances his way, her foot occasionally tapping against his under the shared space of their row. The man beside them, Warren Caldwell, typed aggressively on his tablet. The stylus clicks, sharp and rhythmic, like Morse code tapped in disdain. When the seatbelt sign blinked off, Marcus seized the chance to breathe away from the tension. "Excuse me," he said. Caldwell barely moved, but with a sigh that felt more like a punishment than an exhale, he rose stiffly, letting Marcus pass into the aisle. As Marcus straightened up, Sophie subtly slipped a folded note into his hand. Her touch was light, but her eyes were serious. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he made his way down the aisle, past nodding heads and flickering screens toward the rear lavatory. Once inside the cramped metal box, he locked the door, leaned against the sink, and unfolded the paper. "That guy gives me the creeps. If he says anything weird to you when I'm not there, tell me. My mum's a lawyer who specializes in discrimination cases. She'd eat him alive." Despite everything, Marcus smiled, not just at the note but at the ferocity behind it. Sophie didn't just see what was happening, she acknowledged it. And in a world where so many chose silence that meant everything, he stayed in the lavatory longer than necessary, letting the fan buzz drown his thoughts. Then, with a deep breath, he returned to the aisle. But as he neared row 16, his stomach dropped. Caldwell was leaned in toward Sophie, his voice low but intense. Sophie's posture was stiff, her face flushed with frustration. As Marcus approached, Caldwell's words reached his ears. "Be more careful about the company you keep. I'm simply suggesting that a young lady like yourself—" "Is everything okay here?" Marcus asked sharply, stopping beside the row. Sophie looked up, relieved. Caldwell straightened slowly, voice smooth. "Fine. Just offering some friendly advice." "Unsolicited advice," Sophie snapped, "about who I should sit next to. I was merely pointing out the risks of certain associations, something your parents might appreciate given the circumstances." The implication hung in the air like a toxin. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his jaw tensed. "I need to get back to my seat." Caldwell stood with exaggerated civility. "Of course. Wouldn't want to keep you from your studies." As Marcus settled back in, Sophie leaned toward him, voice barely a whisper. "He waited until you left, then told me I should be cautious around people like you. Said it was for my safety." Marcus didn't flinch. He'd heard variations of it before. The barely veiled warnings, the manufactured concern, the paternalistic racism dressed in silken suits. "Just ignore him," he whispered. 3 more hours. But Sophie looked like she wanted to throw her entire book at Caldwell. Marcus reached across the invisible line between them and gave her a quick, silent squeeze on the arm. It was all the thanks he could offer without breaking, and somehow, despite the pressurized cabin and the burning rage under his skin, that simple gesture helped. For now. The tension in row 16 didn't dissipate, it calcified. It wrapped around the 3 passengers like invisible barbed wire, every movement a negotiation, every word a possible landmine. For the next half hour, they maintained a strained choreography. Sophie pretended to read. Marcus pretended to study, and Caldwell pretended not to simmer. When the flight attendants returned with the snack cart, Marcus noticed both Amara and James passing by more frequently, their eyes skimming the row with casual but deliberate attention. It reassured him in a quiet, unspoken way. Someone was watching. Someone saw. Caldwell, perhaps sensing this attention, pivoted. "So, young man," he said suddenly, his tone overly casual, "what takes you to Los Angeles?" "Visiting family." Marcus blinked, momentarily thrown by the shift from hostility to curiosity. He weighed the risks of engagement and opted for politeness. "I'm competing in the National Science Decathlon. Physics Division." Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "Is that so impressive?" He said it like it wasn't. Sophie cut in before Marcus could respond. "He's a finalist, one of 12 in the country, his project's on gravitational waves." Caldwell's expression barely shifted. "Fascinating. And your parents? What do they do?" The question felt loaded. Marcus answered anyway. "My father is a cardiothoracic surgeon. My mother teaches comparative literature." That flicker there it was again. Surprise, discomfort, the recalibration. Marcus had long learned to spot the subtle twitch in someone's eyes when their assumptions were quietly dismantled. "Well, good for you," Caldwell replied. "It's always encouraging to see young people from diverse backgrounds excelling. Shows what's possible with the right opportunities." Each syllable clanged with patronization, the kind that wrapped itself in civility while dragging behind it generations of bias. Sophie's eyes narrowed. "You mean with the right support systems, right? like any student needs to succeed. Of course, Caldwell said, but he didn't mean it. Then came the monologue. You know, back when I was coming up, he began, we didn't have diversity initiatives or quotas. We competed on merit. Period. Marcus felt the familiar burn rise in his chest. Sophie, less practiced in containment, leaned forward. Funny how merit always favored one demographic back then, she said lightly, almost like the system was built that way. Caldwell stiffened. Young lady, you clearly haven't seen the real world yet. These days it's reversed. Talented people get passed over just to meet quotas. Oh, Sophie tilted her head. Is that what happened to you? The color drained from Caldwell's face, only to return in a wave of mottled red. I've had a very successful career, he snapped. Sure, she replied, but it must be hard watching the world evolve past your comfort zone. Marcus nearly choked on a laugh, but the moment was too sharp, too thinly veiled to enjoy. Caldwell turned to him. And what do you think? Surely you don't buy into this idea that success should be handed out like participation trophies? Marcus met his gaze calmly. True merit can only be measured on a level playing field. And despite what some like to pretend, we're not there yet. Caldwell raised his brows, smirking. A convenient perspective from someone benefiting from the system. About as convenient, Marcus said coolly, as yours must have been for decades. The temperature dropped. The man's expression curdled, and just when Marcus wondered if he'd crossed the invisible line his father had always warned him about, James appeared beside their row. How are we doing here? The flight attendant asked, bright smile in place. Can I get you folks anything? The moment cracked, pressure vented just enough to prevent combustion. Caldwell looked away. Marcus asked for water. Sophie followed suit. James offered Caldwell another drink this time, emphasizing coffee. Black, the man muttered. When Amara returned a few minutes later with Marcus's water, a napkin accompanied it. Scribbled in tiny writing on the corner, all good. Marcus nodded, once grateful, because in that moment he understood something. He wasn't alone, and that changed everything. Despite the brief reprieve, the tension didn't vanish. It simply tucked itself under layers of pretense and polite silence. Caldwell sat stiffly sipping his coffee with the kind of restraint that made every swallow feel like a punishment. He didn't speak again for the next 20 minutes, but his presence continued to radiate something heavy, something calculated. Sophie nudged Marcus gently and whispered, so, tell me more about these gravitational waves. And please use the biggest, nerdiest physics words you've got. I want to see steam come out of his ears. Marcus chuckled under his breath, grateful for the redirection. He launched into a breakdown of his project, his voice low and measured but bright with enthusiasm. Binary black hole mergers, space-time distortions, LIGO detectors. It all flowed from him with the confidence of someone who didn't just memorize equations, but understood the poetry behind the numbers. Sophie asked sharp, curious questions, and whether her interest was genuine or performative didn't matter, it was working. Caldwell didn't interrupt, but Marcus noticed the twitch of his jaw, the rigid way he clutched the armrest. Every exchange between Marcus and Sophie was a reminder that the world didn't revolve around his approval, and that infuriated him. Eventually, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into Los Angeles. Please return your seats to the upright position and secure all personal belongings. Marcus exhaled deeply. They were almost free. Sophie turned to him. Got any plans once you land? He shrugged. Just the competition. I was probably going to stay at the hotel between rounds. She wrinkled her nose. That's tragic. You came all the way to LA, and you're not even going to explore. Tell you what, I practically live in 2 cities. If you've got downtime, I'll show you around. Not the touristy stuff, the good spots. Marcus blinked, surprised. You'd do that? Sure. You're officially the only person who's ever made theoretical physics sound kind of sexy. Marcus blushed. Wow. That's definitely a first. She smirked and held out her hand. Phone. He handed it over, and she quickly typed her number in. There. Now if you win tomorrow, you owe me gelato. As they exchanged smiles, Marcus noticed Caldwell watching them from the corner of his eye. Expression unreadable but unmistakably sour. He didn't care anymore. Let him stew. The plane touched down with a soft jolt. A ripple of relieved applause passed through the cabin. The ding of the seatbelt sign turning off was like a bell signaling the end of a test Marcus hadn't studied for, but had passed with more grace than he'd thought himself capable of. As passengers surged to grab bags, Marcus turned slightly to retrieve his phone. In doing so, his elbow nudged Caldwell's coffee cup. A splash of lukewarm liquid sloshed onto the man's tablet. "Watch it," Caldwell snapped loud enough to turn heads. "Are you always this clumsy, or just when you're trying to impress your little girlfriend?" The insult struck like a slap. The sudden escalation shocked Marcus into silence. "It was an accident," Marcus said, keeping his voice level. "I'm sorry." "An accident," Caldwell sneered. "Just like it was an accident that you've been disruptive this whole flight." Sophie whipped around. "Seriously, we've been practically whispering while you've been over there radiating smug for 4 hours. This is exactly the problem with your generation. No respect, no accountability," Caldwell hissed. "And this is exactly the problem with yours," Sophie fired back, believing you're entitled to dominate every room you walk into just because of your zip code and a suit. Caldwell's face turned a dangerous shade of red. Around them, passengers had stopped moving. The cabin was still. Marcus stood frozen, aware of every eye landing on him. The unspoken reality clamped down on him like a vice. If this got physical, he would be blamed not the wealthy white man shouting, but the black teen causing a scene. And then Caldwell said it. "Go ahead, say it's about race. That's what people like you always do." The words exploded like a flare in a dry forest, and Marcus felt the balance teetering on the edge of collapse. Then Amara appeared. "Sir," she said sharply, authority crystallizing in her voice, "that's enough. If you have a complaint, you may take it to the gate agent. But I need you to lower your voice and prepare to deplane." Caldwell turned to her defiant, and that's when another voice from across the aisle added fuel. "I saw the kid bump him on purpose," said the man Caldwell had been chatting with earlier. "They've been causing trouble the whole flight. It was a lie, an obvious, weaponized lie." And Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. The lie echoed like a taunt in a stadium, quiet but deadly. "I saw the kid bump him on purpose." 5 seconds earlier, Marcus had been a student, a finalist in a national competition, a hopeful mind with dreams mapped in gravitational waves. Now, in the eyes of too many watching, he was a problem. Sophie spun toward the accuser. "That's not true. You didn't see anything because it didn't happen." "Watch your tone," young lady, Caldwell snapped, seizing on the moment to escalate. "This is exactly what I've been saying. No respect." Amara stepped closer. "Everyone needs to remain calm and in their seats." But it was already too late. The air in the cabin had thickened with accusation. Passengers watched, some with curiosity, others with judgment, and a few, Marcus could tell, with the cold detachment of people who had already decided who was right and who was wrong. Caldwell turned his full fury on Marcus now. "You think you can disrespect me, disrupt the flight, and then play the victim?" His voice climbed with every word. "This is the real world, son. You don't get a pass because you're young or because you've learned how to make everything about your skin color." There it was. The line crossed, the mask fully off. Marcus opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Not because he didn't have words, but because he knew in that instant any wrong move could brand him for life. His father's voice rang in his mind. "You have to be twice as calm, twice as composed, because they only need one excuse." And then Caldwell reached for his bag. He rose fast, too fast. His arm swung wide, slamming into Marcus's shoulder. It wasn't a hit, but it wasn't accidental either. Marcus flinched, raising his arm to shield himself. And in that chaotic moment, Caldwell lost his balance. He stumbled sideways, and then, with a rage that no longer masked itself as control, he raised his hand and slapped Marcus across the face. The sound was unmistakable, sharp, sickening, time shattered. Marcus's head turned with the force. His eyes blinked in shock. The sting bloomed across his cheek like fire. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth. Amara stepped forward instantly, shouting over the chaos. "Sir, step back now, James," she called over her shoulder. Assistants row 16, but the defining movement came not from the crew, not from the passengers watching. It came from 7 rows back, where a man with salt and pepper hair and weathered hands stood slowly, deliberately. The same man who had boarded quietly unnoticed, just another aging passenger in coach. Michael Cavich. He began walking forward steady, despite his age, despite the tight aisle. And with each step, the noise seemed to dim. Passengers leaned back instinctively, making space for something they didn't fully understand, but somehow recognized as important. "Sir, please return to your seat," James warned. But Michael didn't stop. "I can't do that," he said, his voice firm, his Slovakian accent curling gently around each syllable. "Not this time." He reached row 16 and stopped, placing his body squarely between Marcus and Caldwell. A line had been drawn. Quietly, finally. "You will not touch this young man again," Michael said, voice low but razor-sharp. Caldwell scoffed. "This doesn't concern you, old man. Step aside." Michael didn't move. It concerns all of us when a grown man strikes a child. There was no anger in his tone, no dramatics, just truth, undeniable and unflinching. "I watched you from 7 rows back," Michael continued, "watched how you tried to diminish him with every word. I've seen men like you before. When I was a boy in another country, you wear civility like armor, but your fists tell the truth." Caldwell bristled, but Michael's presence was immovable. "I don't know who you think you are," Caldwell sneered. Michael looked him dead in the eye. "Someone who ran from a mistake 50 years ago. I won't run this time." The words landed like stone in still water. Sophie stared. Marcus blinked, absorbing more than just the defense he was hearing, a confession, a collision of past and present. Behind them, 2 uniformed airport police officers entered the cabin, summoned by flight crew radio. "What's the situation?" one asked. Amara stepped forward, voice calm but urgent. "This gentleman," she gestured to Caldwell, "struck a minor passenger. Multiple witnesses." The lead officer turned to Caldwell. "Sir, we need you to come with us. Now." Caldwell's bluster evaporated. "This is ridiculous. He provoked me." Michael's eyes didn't flinch. "He didn't provoke you. He exposed you." And with that, Warren Caldwell, the man who believed the world bent for his anger, was escorted off the plane. Marcus sat frozen, cheek burning, breath shallow. Then Michael turned to him and offered a hand, not just of support, but of solidarity. "You all right?" he asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "I think so. No one should have to go through that alone," Michael said. "Not anymore." And as Marcus looked around at Sophie, at Amara, at James, at the silent but affirming stares from strangers, he understood something profound. He wasn't alone. Not now. Not ever again. The aisle slowly emptied, the adrenaline that had gripped the cabin, dissolving into murmurs and sidelong glances. Some passengers moved quickly, eager to escape the discomfort of what they'd witnessed. Others slowed their pace, offering Marcus tentative nods or quiet looks of sympathy as they passed. Marcus remained seated still, processing the moment, his cheek pulsing. His heart caught somewhere between shock and gratitude. Sophie stayed beside him, her hand still on his arm, unwilling to move until he did. Michael stood quietly nearby, not saying much, not needing to. His presence alone, steady, unwavering, was enough. Amara returned with calm, measured steps. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were sharp with concern. "The officers would like a brief statement from each of you," she said softly. "No rush. When you're ready." Marcus nodded. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what?" Amara asked, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. "For believing me, for being there." She gave a small, knowing smile. "We're not all blind up here, Marcus. Some of us see exactly what's happening, even when others pretend not to." Michael turned toward Amara. "May I ask your name?" "Amara Davis." He extended a hand. "Thank you, Ms. Davis. You handled that with restraint. Not everyone would have." Amara accepted the handshake with a grateful nod. It shouldn't take courage to do what's right, but sometimes it does. She turned to Sophie. "You too." That was brave. Sophie gave a small shrug, but her jaw was tight. It shouldn't have had to happen. Marcus finally stood. His legs felt like rubber. "We'll give our statements now." The 3 of them, Marcus, Sophie, and Michael, gathered their belongings and moved into the aisle. The plane was mostly empty now, save for the lingering quiet and a few members of the crew tidying up. As they stepped into the terminal, bright fluorescent lights washed over them. People bustled past with luggage and laughter, unaware of what had just happened aboard Flight 1742. But Marcus felt different now. as though he'd stepped through a door he couldn't unwalk through, into a version of himself more awake, more certain. The police had set up a small area off to the side with 3 plastic chairs and a table. Sophie grumbled under her breath about the delay, but Marcus gently shook his head. Let's just get through it. While they waited for the officers to finish reviewing initial reports, Marcus took out his phone. Multiple missed messages from his father blinked on the screen. Are you on the ground? Call me. Everything okay? He hesitated, then stepped aside and hit dial. His father picked up on the first ring. Marcus. I'm okay, Dad, he said softly. I'm safe, but something happened on the plane. He gave a brief, careful summary, omitting none of the critical details. His father was silent at first. Then came the voice Marcus knew all too well, firm level threaded with restrained fury. I'm flying out tonight, Dr. Williams said. They won't get away with this. You don't have to, Marcus replied. I've got people here, people who stood up. There was a pause. Are you hurt? I'll be fine. A beat passed. I'm proud of you, son, his father finally said. Call me again after you give your statement. I want to hear everything. When Marcus returned to the waiting area, Michael and Sophie were still seated. She looked up as he approached. You okay? Yeah, I just called my dad. Michael gestured to the chair beside him. Sit, you've earned it. Marcus lowered himself into the seat and looked around the terminal at the people walking by without a clue at the security personnel nearby, at the 2 friends beside him who had refused to let him face injustice alone. Then he looked at Michael. Why did you do it? Marcus asked. Why stand up for me? Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared ahead, eyes focused on something only he could see. Because I didn't stand up once, he said quietly. A long time ago, and I've been carrying that silence ever since. Marcus watched him, something shifting in his chest. I don't know what your story is, he said. But, thank you. Michael gave a small nod. You'll understand someday. When we have time. If you'll let me. Sophie leaned back in her chair. Well, if this is how your trip started, I can't wait to see what happens next. Despite himself, Marcus laughed. So much had gone wrong, but somehow in the wreckage something unexpected had taken root, a connection. A story no one saw coming. And it wasn't over, not even close. The formal statements didn't take long, 15 minutes of calmly reciting facts, answering a few clarifying questions, signing a brief report. The officers were professional and respectful, though Marcus could still sense that subtle clinical distance in their tone, the way they referred to the incident instead of what it truly was, an assault. Still, he answered every question with clarity. Not once did he raise his voice. Not once did he let emotion blur the truth. He wanted the record to be clean, undeniable. And it was. When they were done, one officer handed Marcus a card. Should you wish to press charges, this will guide you through the process, she said. The airline has copies of the cabin footage. It corroborates your account. Marcus took the card, but said nothing. The officer turned to Michael. Then Sophie thanked them both for their cooperation and departed with the rest of her team. The moment they left, Sophie exhaled audibly. Well, that was exhausting. You okay? Marcus asked. She nodded. Yeah, I can't believe he hit you. I mean, I can, but I can't. Marcus touched the side of his face now, a dull throb. It's not even the slap that stayed with me, he said quietly. It was the moment before, when I realized, if I'd raised my hand to stop him, I'd be the one in handcuffs. Michael, who had been silently watching the ebb and flow of travelers in the terminal, spoke up. That's the cruelty of it, the way power works in these moments. You're forced to choose between your dignity and your safety. Marcus turned to him. What was your moment? Michael hesitated, then looked down at his hands, weathered and shaking just slightly. 1974. I was 16. I saw a boy in my neighborhood, mixed race, get chased by police for something he didn't do. I hid behind a shed and watched. I could have stepped out, could have spoken up. But I didn't. I was scared. He looked up again, his gaze steady. And I've lived with that silence every day of my life. Marcus didn't know what to say. But in that moment, he understood something profound. This wasn't just about a slap or a flight or a report. This was about history, about inherited fear, about all the moments when voices were swallowed, when justice hung just out of reach, and the people who carried those wounds. Sophie stood and stretched. You know what we need, Burgers? The really greasy kind. Marcus laughed. What time even is it? Doesn't matter. Burgers transcend time. Michael smiled. I should be going. My ride's waiting. Marcus stood with him. You sure we could drop you off? Michael waved the thought away. You've done more than enough. Besides, I've got something important to do. He turned to Marcus, eyes glistening. Whatever happens with your competition, know this. You've already won something far greater. Marcus swallowed the lump in his throat. I'll never forget this. I hope you don't, Michael said, and someday when the moment finds you again, you won't hesitate. They shook hands firm and steady. Then Michael turned and walked into the crowd, disappearing among the sea of travelers, one man lighter for having finally spoken, one boy heavier for having inherited a truth. Marcus stood still for a moment. Sophie bumped her shoulder into his. Come on, Einstein. Let's eat. As they moved toward the exit, the sounds of the terminal rolling suitcases echoing intercoms. Children laughing began to blend into something familiar again. But Marcus felt different, grounded, wiser, and somehow even more determined than before. He didn't know what tomorrow's competition would bring, but whatever happened, he knew this: he wouldn't shrink. He wouldn't step back. He wouldn't ever let the silence win. The following morning, the hotel ballroom buzzed with energy. Rows of tables were arranged with precision, each team seated beneath signs labeled with school names, states, and acronyms too nerdy for casual conversation. Judges in navy blazers wandered the room with clipboards, and the stage was set with polished microphones and a giant screen glowing with the words National Science Decathlon Finals. Marcus sat in the middle of his school's table laptop, open fingers moving with sharp efficiency as he reviewed his last-minute calculations. Around him, his teammates murmured strategies and answered practice questions, but he barely registered the noise. His thoughts were focused, but not just on the math. His mind still echoed with the events of the flight, the slap, the lies, Michael's voice rising like a shield between him and violence. Every moment felt etched into his bones. Sophie, now seated in the audience section near the front row, caught his gaze and gave a small thumbs up. She'd offered to stay through the event, claiming she had nothing better to do. He knew it wasn't entirely true. But he also knew she'd never admit that it mattered to her. It mattered to him. A tap on the shoulder pulled him back. His team captain, Jennifer, leaned in. You good? Marcus nodded. More than good. The event began with introductory speeches. Then one by one teams were called forward for their rapid-fire question rounds. Marcus's school was third. As he stood at the podium, lights shining on his face, his name announced across the room, he took a steadying breath, and he smiled. This was where he belonged, not just because he was brilliant, but because he had earned it. Every microaggression he'd absorbed, every sideways glance he'd endured, every time someone underestimated him, had brought him to this very stage. But it no longer defined him. Now he defined himself. The questions came fast: thermodynamics, quantum mechanics, mathematical proofs. Marcus answered without hesitation. Each word landed clear and sure, each number confidently correct. When their round ended, the applause was thunderous. He returned to his seat, heart pounding not from nerves, but from pride. Hours passed. Calculations, debates, presentations, and finally the announcement: third place Washington West STEM, polite claps. Second place Brooklyn Institute of Applied Science, louder applause. And your 2025 National Science Decathlon champion is Atlanta Metro High School. The room erupted. Marcus's team leapt to their feet, hugging, cheering. Jennifer nearly tackled him in excitement. Photographers snapped pictures, trophies were handed out. But through it all, Marcus scanned the crowd until he saw her. Sophie stood with her hands cupped around her mouth, cheering louder than anyone else. She caught his eye and mouthed gelato. Tonight. He nodded, grinning wide. Backstage, between the laughter and handshakes, Marcus stepped outside for a moment. The afternoon sun was warm, cutting through a light breeze. Then he heard the voice. Impressive. He turned. Michael Cavich stood beneath a tree, hands in his pockets, wearing the same calm expression from the flight. He hadn't left LA after all. I thought you had somewhere important to be, Marcus said, surprised but smiling. I did, Michael replied. Turns out it was here. They stood in silence for a moment, both understanding the gravity of what wasn't said. "You really did it," Michael added. "Not just the win, the way you carried yourself. That's legacy." Marcus looked at him. "So what do I do with it?" Michael's answer was quiet but certain. "You pass it on, like someone did for you." Marcus nodded, eyes steady. "I will." And as the cheers from inside echoed out into the light, he realized something profound. This story hadn't begun on that plane. It hadn't begun with the slap. It had always been about choosing dignity, even when the world handed you anything but. And now the next chapter was his to write. The evening air in Los Angeles was golden warm, with the kind of breeze that carried stories, one's unfolding, one's ending, and one's just beginning. Marcus sat on the edge of a stone fountain outside the hotel, a small cup of pistachio gelato in one hand, Sophie beside him devouring her chocolate swirl like it held all the answers to the universe. "I told you," she said, spoon poised in triumph. "Victory tastes like overpriced gelato." He laughed genuinely for the first time in what felt like days. "You were right." Lights blinked on across the courtyard. Somewhere inside his team was still celebrating, but Marcus had stepped away not to escape the joy, but to honor the quiet after the storm. Sophie leaned back, her eyes following the stars just beginning to appear above. "Do you think it's always going to be like that? You know, having to carry that armor?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then with clarity he said, "Maybe. But I also know I'm not carrying it alone anymore." She nodded, satisfied. "Good answer." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes until her voice broke through again. "Do you think he Caldwell learned anything?" Marcus looked out toward the horizon. "I don't know, maybe not, but everyone else on that flight did." Sophie turned to him. "Especially you." He smiled softly. "Yeah, especially me." As the night deepened, Marcus pulled out his phone and opened a blank note. He didn't write equations. Not this time. He began writing a letter. To Michael, to his father, to every kid who had ever sat in silence when they wanted to scream. To himself. Because some moments rewrite your story, not with rage, not with revenge, but with resolve. And this was one of them. He hit save, tucked the phone away, and stood. Sophie joined him. Together they walked slowly through the courtyard, two silhouettes lit by lamplight and the soft sound of water rippling behind them. Tomorrow the world would go back to spinning. News cycles would churn, names would be forgotten. But Marcus wouldn't. Not the name of the man who stood up for him. Not the feeling of choosing stillness when fury begged for release. Not the truth that courage doesn't always roar, it sometimes whispers, "I'm still here." And so he stepped forward, older, not in years, but in spirit. No longer just a finalist in a science competition, but a boy who had faced injustice at 30,000 feet and refused to stay grounded. This wasn't just a story about a flight gone wrong. It was about the unshakable dignity of a boy who chose restraint over rage. About a stranger who refused to let history repeat itself in silence. And about the small acts of defiance that ripple louder than violence ever could. Because when injustice tries to erase you, your very presence becomes resistance. If this story moved you, share it. Tell someone, speak out when it matters. You never know who's watching. You never know who needs to see that one person still stands for what's right. Comment below, have you ever witnessed a moment that changed everything? We're listening. Your story matters too.